Hi, and welcome back to the Cities Reimagined podcast. I'm your voice of choice, Johannes, and this is Reimagining Cities Beyond Sustainability. Today's episode will take us back to August when I traveled to Alpbach, which is a small village in the mountains of the western Austrian Alps. And you might have heard of this tiny village before, because despite of its size, it has quite a reputation. Because every August, there's a European Forum Alpbach happening there, where politicians rub shoulders with artists, with scientists, with civil society, but also with the villagers who live there. And they all go to the same Gasthaus, so to the same inns, to the typical Austrian restaurants. So for me, last year, it was a great pleasure to be able to join and be invited to the 10 by 100 workshop, which took place as part of the program. And this workshop brought together a very broad team across disciplines and backgrounds, including even mayors, professional athletes, researchers, and also representatives of military even. So today we have Caroline Paulick-Thiel and Indy Johar, who are behind the 10 by 100 framework on the show. And they will tell us what that is, what 10 by 100 is, why we met in Alpbach, and they will give us a lot of other insights and inspiration. Caroline is a Berlin-based strategic designer and public policy expert, and she specialized in transformative innovation within the public sector. She's also the director and co-founder of Politics of Tomorrow. And Indy is a London-based architect. He's a social innovator and serial entrepreneur, and he's best known as the co-founder of Project 00 and Dark Matter Labs, which are both organizations focused on systemic change, urban innovation, and sustainable urbanization. So for today's episode, hold tight, because there's a lot of unpack in this one. And if you're wondering how Europe and its city might lead to global societal transformations, this show is really for you. The next 45 minutes will not disappoint you. Also, I would like to say thanks to Teresa Schwarz and the European Forum Alpbach team, because we could use their amazing media facilities, which were really, really fancy, I have to say. If you like today's episode, make sure to subscribe to Cities Reimagined on your favorite podcasting platform. And if you want to reach out, drop me an email at Johannes@Anthropocene and make sure to follow Indy, Caroline, and me on LinkedIn. But enough for the monologue. Here's my conversation with Caroline and Indy from the European Forum Alpbach. Indy, thank you so much for being here, for meeting me in the Austrian Alps. Do you want to tell me a little bit why we are here, why we meet in the Tyrolean Alps and in this rather fancy container of the European Forum Alpbach, where we see just the guests flocking into the opening of the forum?
Maybe I can start with that, because since 2015 I've been coming here and basically tried to contribute to various formats of the forum, from seminar week to leadership training to certain types of facilitation. In 2022, we both decided that this is a good space to open for experimentation and actually look at a different way of bringing concepts and practices together. And this is when the 10 times 100 lab series started in 2022 and went for 3 years.
Yeah.
And we're back here this year with a different version of that, because we learned a lot of the last 1,000 days, understanding that it actually needs a cohort and a group of people that relate to each other and that learn to trust each other and that have a personal relationship with each other in order to do work they have not done before.
Why do you think that why in the Alps? Why in the mountains? Does it bring something special to the work?
I think from my perspective, I mean, there's a situational why, which is, I think, quite important. Firstly, why Europe? Is this conversation relevant? And I think we face a challenge where our means of organizing transition increasingly is becoming focused on autocratic power. And I don't mean autocracy as in sort of the kind of big scale autocracies of dictators and all that. Even democracies are centralizing power and becoming increasingly tyrannical in terms of their theory of control. So what we're seeing is a systematic shift as the transition accelerates, and the transition accelerates through increasing volatility, that we're seeing this centralization of power. Centralization of power. Now, Europe, uniquely perhaps around the world, has perhaps a little bit more space to examine this tendency in a more structural sense. And I think if Europe can find a way to do large-scale transition, not through autocracy, but through a movement of agents and actors working together in self-coordination, not through control and power over, Europe will have found a new organizing principle for civilization. And that, I think, is the magic moment. It is not AI, these are all facilitation technologies. The real thing is, how does society organize itself in complexity? That is the paradigm leap we're facing. And most societies are not finding a way to organize, so they're retorting either to simplification, reduction of information, or they're retorting to dictatorship and control over systems. So for me, I'm here positionally in Europe. Why that? I'm here because I think this has to be not an Anglo-Saxon-centric conversation. And what this provides is a heart of Europe which is not rooted in an Anglo-Saxon space, but is rooted in an open space at the heart of Europe. So this is why I think it's important to be here. And then I think this place also rhymes with the history. I think the scale of the transition we're facing is equivalent to 1945 when Alpbach was built, or the Forum was built. It rhymes with history. So there's a reason why I think the Forum is relevant in this moment of systemic renewal of Europe. And our ability to build this capability, I think, is probably the central question that's available to us. So that's why I'm here.
Wonderful. Tell me a little bit, both of you dedicated a lot of your life on urban areas and cities. Tell me a little bit about what led you there. What motivated you to go to this step, to go down this path around urban areas? What fascinates you about that?
I think in the density of living arrangements, there is a different way of depending on each other, in a good and in a bad way, or in a positive and a negative way. And on the other hand, there is the possibility to experience simultaneously so many different worlds that are overlapping. And in this overlapping can actually produce something that is new or that hasn't been done or seen before.
When was the moment you realized that? Was that because I asked a similar question to all the guests, and it's so super interesting when they come up with sometimes even childhood stories, what fascinates them about cities and how they experience that.
I think for me, it's like I live in a spot in Berlin where 1,000 worlds are overlapping. You walk into one street and it's full of misery. You walk into another street and it's full of luxury. And these ways of like how space and life is actually, converging, but also then different scales of looking or being able to have access to options that will shape who you are, how you engage with the surroundings you're living in, how you also treat what is not yours. And I think living in a space like this for more than 15 years and also see it changing is something that I find very fascinating. And on the other hand, having the possibility to interact with it.
How about you, Indy?
Yeah, I mean, I was in my third year of university. I was asked to write. I was not a very good architecture student till that time. My professor, Helena Webster, asked me to write an essay on the future of urbanism. And I just fell in love at that moment in time of reading everything. It expanded my world from design to anthropology, sociology, philosophy, economics. And suddenly the world became intersectional. And I suppose the number one thing for me is that urbanity in its true sense, or the urban condition, certainly at that time, was an intersectional function. I think right now, if I was sitting here with this, what I was processing, I think the urban-rural divide is bullshit. It's intellectually vacuous. I think we are more accurately living in an anthropogenic world, and there is everything is human manufactured. The rural is not, the Alps aren't wild, they're cultivated landscapes, systemically cultivated by human landscapes. We are seeing situations for example, in Spain, when humans, shepherds and farmers die and they no longer pass on their land and there's no goats herding them, where fires are coming alive, because actually we've built a human-cultivated landscape. So I think we need to start to think about how we're living in the anthropogenic world and a planet, as opposed to urban and rural. There was no rural. I was invited to somewhere in Girona as part of a gathering, and when you looked at this rural, very far away, beautiful place, it was connected to satellites, it was relying on supply chains which were entirely planetary. You realized there was nothing separated about it. It was just the convenience of the illusion and the delusion of separation, whereas actually it was fundamentally only viable in the full of networks and relationships. So I actually think we have to start to think fundamentally differently about this urban-rural landscape, and it also situates itself more historically in the kind of delusion of rural and the wild as well, which is the cultivated and the wild, which I think is also a false reality, increasingly in a world where pretty much all of our bioregions are going to have to become increasingly bioengineered to be able to deal with climate breakdown effects. And also the kind of reality when you look back in history where places like the Amazon and the Terra Preta, you start to realize the Amazon is a cultivated garden, human-cultivated symbiotic relationship as opposed to a wild system. And I think we have to start to reimagine some of these relationships in different formats. And I think we're going to have to embrace the reality we are living in systemically a human co-engineered environment life. We are bioengineering the planet at a systemic level. There's no separation.
I still would say in the context of 10 times 100, we look at cities as a kind of space where you can drive demand and where you can also drive transformation. And if you look at it as a metabolism within its regional or biophysical capacity, there is a way of engaging with a lot of lives at the same time that is different from what you find in situations where there's more, let's say, natural, or I don't know how you would call it, biology.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the phenomena, and I think the phenomena for me is rooted in the emergent function of a functioning identity. So cities can construct an identity field that I think is a combination of entanglements, relationships, which allow for the formation of identity in complex systems. Identities aren't, municipalities. I think municipalities are just one part of that identity system. The identity allows for a city to take a symbiotic relationship of itself. So the identity allows for consciousness of Alpbach's relationship with the planet. So I think you're right that I think these locations create the power of identity and thereby agency, and thereby allow for actually symbiotic transformation back into the system.
I would love if it is like this, because right now, also something that we discussed during the last 2 days is that right now cities are an asset. Cities are an investment landscape. You actually own cities, or very few people can own a lot of parts within cities that are creating return of their investment in a way that is extracting a lot of the other things that they, are surrounded by. So I think I would love if cities can become these places of identity.
So when I say identity, I think it's the fundamental thesis is our theory of value. We talk about human values, but our theory of value is rooted in assets. And cities are an amalgamation of direct and amplifier assets and utility demand creation frameworks. And the entanglement of those creates economic possibilities, both legacy as value, but also future-oriented value. Now, I think the challenge that it does throw up is that, and I think this is one of the most fundamental questions that we're facing right now, is that humans increasingly are less valuable than they've ever been. We're living through the Engels pause, a new Engels pause, where the value of being human is significantly reduced and asset value is appreciating in the system. And in that reality, when we talk about the identity of cities, we're talking about the identity of cities to preserve the theory of asset and value rather than actually the optimization and release of humans. Because actually, frankly, humans are becoming systemically devalued. And there is a really interesting question there about when we talk about the transition of cities. Are we talking about the transitions of people, or are we talking about the transition of the physical assets of a city? And more likely, we're really talking about the latter. Now, the question that opens up is a much more structural question, whether the systemic devaluation of being human, which everyone listening to the podcast sees in the number of people homeless, the number of people ill, not having access to services or support, the devaluation of all those things and all the microcrimes and the violences that are released in a system. That is a systemic impact. And that, unfortunately, over time, if we end up going to any form of conflict, becomes an entangled asset destruction framework. So there is where asset theory and real-world loss of human value will effectively collide.
I would like to pull us a little bit out of this rabbit hole, this very, very detailed rabbit hole we are already going into. Caroline, you already mentioned 100 or 10 by 100 converter, the workshop we were part of over the last 1.5 days. It was really inspiring and really great facilitation. Thank you for that. Tell us a little bit more about where does it come from? What is the motivation? You brought together such an amazing group of people to work together over 1.5 days, a really transdisciplinary team, or also across sectors, age groups. It was really fascinating. Tell us a little bit about that.
I think based on a discussion, that goes into details, because at some point we have to, in order to understand what is a valuable or appropriate adaptation of our practices in turning the dial towards something that is getting us up in the morning and at the same time gives at least a horizon of impact or the possibility to do something about the current trajectories. And I think the first version of 10 times 100 was a kind of self-organized scaffolding to actually involve ourselves with the severity of the realities that we're facing, and also being to digest actually what we're in, but also what is coming at us. And the converter now is trying to look at conversion rates between ambitions or concepts and a practice or a new practice emerging or implementation of these ideas. And for doing so, we brought together a group that works across the whole policy cycle, across age groups. We think it's intergenerational work that has to be done. We're just, maybe even at the end of where we can facilitate or open a certain door, but you're even part of the next generation doing the actual work and opening up a new framework, how this type of organizing across scales, across sectors, across cultures can actually take place in relation, not by separating ourselves more or othering more, but by connecting ourselves again to the realities on the ground and also building relationships that can maybe expand the human capacity.
What was the most interesting part which stuck with you over the last days? What came out, what you would like to highlight?
For me, one of the most interesting parts was right at the beginning, where I think very rarely do you have a structured framework to reflect and be reflected and be meta-patterned in a way of the practices that you're learning on. And I think there was a brilliant format put together to allow for that reflective analysis. And I think that's a very powerful device, because we often talk about health retreats and other things like this, but actually very, very rarely do you construct these practice-based environments where you can have a systemic reflection with peers who are, perhaps, certainly for me, some very extraordinary peers around the room. And I think that was, for me, was a very powerful framework, because that reflective device also thereby lay out an emergent coherence that then followed through over the next following days.
All right.
Yeah, I think for me, focusing on our organizing practices, first of all, and not, let's say, only on our individual well-being or how we cope with the crisis, but actually relating it to something how we are, but also what we do. And being able to trust and give the cohort and the people who were there the power to trust in themselves that they're coming out with something that is of relevance. And that happened today. And I'm very happy about that. I think that what we are moving towards is to develop a framework for cross-scale / large-scale organizing, in understanding what is a different theory or theoretical framework, but also how can it be matched with care or relational practices, community organizing practices on the ground that are already happening and that can signal us, or from which we can learn from possible modes how to leverage each other. And I see in that work a kind of spiraling learning engine that needs to be engaged with, or maybe also opened up to other people who are listening right now, in order to understand better, not how we can scale, because maybe fascists or right-wing activists are organizing already much better across scales, but they're driving that organizing by fear and by domination. And what we want to do is to bring different values and also different principles into the practice. And I think we have been weak in developing something that elevates people and that lets people unfold in their capacity to actually be human or being related. And I feel there is something in it that wants to show itself and will show itself over the next 1,000 days.
Can you tell me a little bit more about, or anybody who's not familiar with it, what large-scale organization is?
Yeah, I mean, I can sort of... So firstly, in the broadest category, you could say large-scale organizing already happens. So you could say a representative parliament is a large-scale organizing infrastructure. You can also say, our monetary system is an organizing framework, is a planetary scale organizing framework. So one, recognizing we have large-scale organizing systems. The question that we face is, how do you do large-scale organizing at the scale of paradigmatic shifts? So this goes back to right at the beginning of the conversation when we were talking about how we're seeing, as volatility increases, degenerative volatility increases, the tendency for control increases. This is why we're seeing authoritarianism or control-centric democracies even. So at the same time, what's very clear is if you want to organize Vienna to deal with its flooding risk, this is no longer a problem for just Vienna city. It's a problem for every landowner. And our ability to organize and pool risk at the whole city scale is increasingly critical if we're going to be able to manage these sort of systemic risks. Or whether you look at how you cool Madrid by 8.5 degrees in the summer, or whether you look at Stockholm and electrification of Stockholm, you start to realize that these are no longer single-point infrastructures of response. What they require is large multi-agent responses by multiple actors in the city. Now, that organizing is not a function of how many people can you get into a room or a conference room. It's a function of how do you organize 1,000, 10,000, 100,000 people. Our capacity to organize, not through control, 100,000 people, to actually either make commitments of change in their own sort of behaviors, commitments of change on how they allocate, commitments of change in terms of coordinated transformation of buying or agreeing or agreement for a new form of policy behavior, shared compulsion. Our ability to construct these agreement landscapes from the bottom up, as opposed to from the representation down, is for me one of the biggest things of large-scale organizing. Mm-hmm. And I think that is also, the class of large-scale organizing is no longer a 1960s open space technology problem for me. For me, it also sits in the role of critical technologies, like the role of using machine learning systems to human-machine pairing models, which allow for deliberation in fundamentally different ways. We're seeing the use of machine-assisted coaching frameworks. How do we start to create a new form of participatory democracy, which is machine-assisted, which also preserves the cognitive security and the sovereignty of the people that live there? So this is also about creating a new form of organizing infrastructure, all the way from sensing, sense-making, commitment, all the way through to shared endeavors and other coordination and shared purchases. So for me, that is the landscape of large-scale organizing, not rooted through traditional market or representations.
But how do we make that happen? Because you know all these questions, how we see that now with the rise of AI, what you already mentioned with the shift towards, let's say, right-wing policies and authoritarianism, I see more and more that it seems like we have lost, let's say, the battle for the story which you can tell, might it be positive or negative. But the sustainability story, let's call it story, in the last years has just gone down in priority or in how open and acceptable or attractive it is for people across countries from rural to urban landscape. Are we there once more that we lose this battle for the story at the moment? And how do we create a story which engages different people, not just, let's say, the people in the workshop here, but a broader society?
I think on the story part, Indy is probably better to go into depth. But I can just say, if we think we've lost, we might lose. Because if we actually look around us, I mean, we're sitting here at the European Forum Alpbach with some of the most privileged people around us within a beautiful landscape that is degenerating, yes, and visibly, but on the other hand, so much more lush than other parts of this world where there's no drinking water anymore, where there's hardly food to be provided. So I feel in terms of understanding what we have at our hands right now is one thing. And for me, it would be more, and maybe this is also a combination we can bring here, about understanding what infrastructures we have in place, what resources we have at our hands, what practices or actions we actually take. I don't have to say one word, and I can make a huge difference to how I engage with the biophysical world and how I engage with resources. I don't have to say one word to do that. I feel there is maybe in an era of a so-called knowledge society, or also a society that is constantly activated through dopamine and ideas of how to be or how to behave or what to pay attention to, maybe rather a loss of understanding our material optionality to make a difference here and right now. The story part, I feel, is very important, and there's always people in the space, gladly for me, that take care of the story. Also understand that it's not only about narration, but also about language, and that how we code language is already mirroring our logics of how we dominate the world around us. So I feel there are very capable people in this cohort engaging on the one hand with definitions or also scientific terms, and on the other hand with the more philosophical side that is needed in order to expand our notion of, how we engage.
I know. So going back to your question, there's nothing left to sustain. I think if you follow the numbers, you realize at a systemic level, most of our corporate infrastructure is not really viable if it was to price in social, environmental, true costs onto that reality. So when we talk about sustaining, I think there's a harder question that we have to start to look into the eyes, that our lives are a function of systemic extractionism. If you were to price your T-shirt, my shirt, it's no longer a 45-pound shirt, it's 250 to 455 pounds. So I think there's a hard question at the front end of it. I think sustainability, as we've discussed it, ethical chocolate bars and ethical coffee cups. I think this is a kind of a delusion of the rich and the few. And so that's, I think, one thing. Second thing I'd say is that right now, the only political infrastructure that I think allows us to be able to construct a viable politics is security. And this is, I think, from the work we're doing, is around how do you secure energy, water, cognitive security, nutrient supply, critical minerals, like this stack of foundational economies. Then the key question becomes, is security bounded? As in, can Austria secure its own future? Can Germany secure its own future by boundary? And you very quickly come to a realization, very difficult. So what you have to start to take is not a bounded view on security, but a systems view on security. And then you very quickly realize, if we lose the Theiss ice shelf in the Antarctic, well, most places are pretty much underwater. So what you start to realize is not only do we have an entangled dimension of security, we have a systems dimension of security, and we have some degree of bounded view. So I think the political infrastructure narratives are all going to run through security. This is also going to then change the economic landscapes. So the economics of transition will no longer be rooted in sustainability or green finance. They are, in my view, being executed by security economics. This is where A lot of the, we're just in the middle of a lot of work focused entirely on that. So yes, the political course is changing. The other thing I think is really important to recognize is why. So I think one of the things to recognize, certainly in my narration, I think the progressives were out on the street marching with banners. The right reconstructed the economic landscape. So the right constructed a labor economy rooted in precarity and vulnerability, and recognizing that allowed people to be instrumentalized for a labor force in a productive industrial economy. And that vulnerability was systemically critical to instrumentalizing people for labor and the productive economy. And that vulnerability and that precarity has also created the landscape of fear. And so we are operating in a landscape where we have constructed a psychogeography of fear and vulnerability, and we have stripped really assets and pathways to assets and independence away from people to actually force them to be systemically dependent. Varying degrees around the world, varying parts of the population. So I think what we have to also recognize is we've created the psychogeography in which the story has become irrelevant.
Mm-hmm.
And the question is, are we fighting for the story or the creation of the psychogeographies? And I think we lost the war, if you want to put it that way, in who constructed the psychogeography. And we are now living in their world.
And still, I feel if you look at systems change from the margins, if you look at how communities regain their psychogeography, there is a kind of shift from solely stabilizing the current status quo through resistance. And I would call it busy work, like a kind of pooling our attention and capacity around things that don't very much matter if we look at what is actually to be done in the world around us. And understanding that it's not only around stabilizing the status quo or resisting what is pushed at us, but regenerating or, reframing what is a space that we want to move into. Mm-hmm. Because I feel also on the progressive side, there's a lot of anti, and then we still say the word that we're against, but it's very hard to name a word of what we're for and where we're actually moving into a direction that is bound or rooted in a different logic and a different way of being with each other.
Tell me a little bit, but where do you see the role of cities and the creativity of people living in cities? We already touched upon that a little bit before, that there's, as far as I understood it, is it still useful to talk about, urbanization and this kind? Because there's also a book came out this year, which questions how we define cities. There's now urban processes in rural areas as well. And does it still make sense to define it as such? We see it probably also here in Alpbach, you have urban processes where people get potentially displaced, or the farmer up there cannot afford buying more land because there's more pressures on the land and so on. But what is the role of the cities in all of that? Cities as in people, municipalities, or local public administration, businesses, and all of that. Where do you see that?
I mean, building on what you just said before, I feel that the way a city metabolizes resources or also recreates them, builds economies, possibly regenerative economies around these metabolisms, is something that one can see happening in some of the cities like Paris, regenerating the river. In Copenhagen, looking at how a different type of mobility is bound or is combined with biodiversity in the city. But I feel, we're just at the slight tip of what is actually possible, because it's very hard. And this is the real challenge, I feel, to reimagine within a built environment that can't be fundamentally changed because we don't have the resources and the material to make it look or rework it completely. So what we need to do is to reimagine a different way of metabolism or metabolizing, being in relation with the biophysical world in a built environment that might still look the same, from the outside, but has a completely different wiring in the inside.
Yeah, no, I agree with this point about metabolism. I think I'd get into, over the last 20 years, urban renaissance agenda has shifted the metabolism of cities largely through consumption and what I would call synthesis. The whole thing of serendipity, the whole engines of like, how do you combine knowledges together? And what we've created is a systemic cost of living, which means that you have to hunt higher value in the city. So we've created this very particular economic engine on synthesis, on consumption, and advanced market consumption, and effectively precarity on the other side. That economic engine of cities defined Starbucks, coffee culture, all of this culture that we've seen, the whole thing about open plan offices, the buzz of work, all of, like you could say, the productive economy of a city has been malformed in a very particular way. The challenge that we face, and I think this is what is the new productive economy of a city? And if you're talking about the new productive economy of a city, I think it is fundamentally rooted in a different metabolism. So if you're talking about complex work, if you're talking about work rooted in multiple intelligences, what is a quiet city? So what is a city which is quiet, recognizing actually the impact noise has on the human body? What is a city which is able to actually contemplative city? What is a city that allows and encourages not the freneticism of work, but a freneticism of relationships, but actually ability to live in silence for a moment, would live in a form of contemplation, to operate in a different bandwidth of relationships and embodiments in place. So I think my deeper structure, and at this point exactly where Caroline was going, is I think our metabolism of cities is fundamentally miscoded. And cities which are able to provide this other context for deep work, for multidimensional work, for high levels of attention, for multiple intelligences to fuse, they are likely to be the productive cities of the 21st century. And I think that's a completely different type of city in itself. And I think the challenge that we face is our urban metabolism is out of date.
How do we get there?
I think, like I was just thinking, what you're describing is very much relating to aliveness. I think aliveness will have value. And what we see, maybe just like very few seeds in terms of giving value to a tree canopy, giving value to a space that actually, creates a fresher microclimate, a space that can hold water or is creating shade, has a more healthy population over long term, has value, and should also picture that value in a city budget. And I feel this is, for example, in Berlin, where we're taking first steps of actually supporting initiatives that are caring for green or blue infrastructure in a very, let's say, motivated but intrinsic capacity to understand what is this care work that they're actually doing, how can you value this care work they're doing, not only financially, in health, in more systemic outcomes, but also how can the city be helped, because right now they can't change their budget structure. What can be done to create a kind of, and we would have to use a different word for a shadow budget, because it would not be a shadow budget, it would actually be a highlight budget. Something that is giving, or what you said before in terms of creating a vector, creating a horizon budget, for something that you want to work towards and that you not want to hide. So I feel there are first steps taken, and also in the Net Zero Cities network in terms of looking at systemic investment or certain portfolios of doing that work. But we are still with the converter and with 10 times 100 in a space where these knowledges and these practices need to be connected, but also translated. And I feel also your podcast is part of that translation work.
Yeah. And we had, just to connect to that, because it reminded me, we had on this podcast stories of several cities, for example, the city of Mechelen, which had a city panel which took on a more than human approach for their public space development, which is very fascinating. Or the city of Ghent, which is looking at de-sealing and rewilding parts of the city. So for me, these examples are very much, they come from a local municipality, but it shows how also this kind of discourses we have here over time goes into this policy making.
I think the hard challenge is what Indy mentioned in terms of what are examples of a different productive economy within a city, and how do you rewire the metabolism of everything. Because I feel on the one hand we have a different way of valuing green, gray, blue infrastructures or the spaces that we're dependent on, and then it's a kind of still very modernist way of looking at that, at natural resources or a bio-based material, but it's just not deep enough in order to reframe this metabolism.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, what do we do? I think the painful thing to say is we're nowhere close, right? So I sit in conversations where people say, oh, but we're doing the most we can. But the reality is it's not that it's not enough, it's self-terminating, right? It's whether it's enough or not, it doesn't get us through. And I think that's where the hard challenge really starts, because I don't think we are systemically looking at either the risks or the scale of work that's happening. The greatest, easiest parallel to make is we are at the time of literally post-war Europe, rebuilding Europe. It is a moment where we have to think at the scale of Marshall Plan and the reconstruction of our economies and society at structural level. Yet most leadership right now is still trying to defend against volatility. And I think that is a systemic, never-ending fight that will only end in loss. And I think the real hard challenge is to look the problem straight in the eyes and start to play and stabilize. So we have to invest in, firstly, stability. So I talk about security. If Europe can become fundamentally stabilize its energy, water, cognitive security, critical minerals, it will become a flight of capital and flight of human talent from around the world. Second step, once you stabilize, then you can start to move forward as you start to drive into that. But we have to be more honest in the scale of the transformations. And I get it, politicians have short windows. But the reality is
everyone depends on it.
Everyone will depend on this. And the volatility will just keep increasing.
I'm afraid we have to come to an end at some point because, Caroline, you need to go to the next session. But anyway, we're not closing just yet. But we should have this kind of conversation maybe again next time we meet, because I think then we can see what happened in between also. But I want to ask you one personal question, because you're very busy people, and I was wondering what personal practices and habits keep you resilient in your work. What do you practice? How do you keep sane in the insanity of today?
You start.
I just embrace the insanity.
Yeah.
I think I don't know what is sane anymore, whether this world is sane or another world is. I think I have a fundamental, maybe the only reason I keep sane is I have a fundamental belief that life wants to live and humans want to persist. And in that, I also think the biological system, the planetary system, wants to thrive and exist. So for me, I think this transformation is not only viable, necessary, and will be demanded and will execute. And I think we can also do this. I also think this is going to be one of the greatest transformations of us as a civilization at a planetary scale. I also think this is an extraordinary invitation. It's not just crisis, it's a kind of metamorphosis of us at every level, at the level of how we imagine ourselves, of how we organize, all the way through to what we value. I think all of these things are changing. So if you're a rapid capitalist, I think this is going to be the greatest transformation of value. Enjoy it.
How about you, Caroline?
I had to think of the kind of silicon-based and slime-based challenge of the organisms on the one side, the kind of human body and the difficulties with the constraints of the body on the one hand, and the imagination and the possibility of the mind on the other. But there is no contradiction. And I feel in order to stay sane, or to maybe even become more sane in a time of great doubt or great questioning, is to remember the vast knowledge we have in our bodies, and maybe also to rediscover some of the spaces and the times where we can create unprecedented focus or unprecedented connection through our bodies. And I I hope all of the listeners have a practice that actually is embodied and can tap into that knowledge that is, more than thousands of years old and connects us to this planet in a way that we sometimes very much forget.
For me personally, because we talked about it in the very, very beginning before the recording really, it's the breakfast that keeps me sane also at times. But to the last question, that's a bit off topic for this. We might make a breakfast podcast at some point. But I was wondering, the last question I also ask all the guests on the show, what are three short things you would suggest to anybody who wants to change anything about their cities?
I would say, and this is something we developed in 10 times 100, we developed like a tiny little protocol, and it has 3 steps. And the first step is to sense outwards and engage with the unprecedented situation of what cities are going through, and maybe also research a little bit into some of the scientific backing, material constraints, actual interrelated crises that we're facing. Then look inward, look at your day-to-day, look at your work, look at how you are with your friends, with your family, with your colleagues, and ask yourself, is this how you want to spend your time? And is this how you want to spend your intelligence, or how you want to evolve in this state that we're in order to look forward and also define what is appropriate now? Like, what is relevant for you right now in order to engage with a moment of great questioning that might require for you to shift your attention and shift your priorities.
Thanks for sharing. How about you, Indy?
I think for me, number one would be look the problem in the eyes. I'm not interested in your solutions. I'm interested in comprehending the scale of the problem. Second, I would say very much what Caroline was saying. I think this is a revolution not just of solutions, it's a revolution of how we imagine ourselves. Fundamentally, it's a revolution of what it means to be human. And I think the science and the comprehension of what it means to be human has far outstripped our cultural lock-ins of a 19th century idea of being human. And I think any pathway of really responding at scale will require us to actually do a structural transformative work of how we imagine ourselves. And this is what we've done before. You could argue the Newtonian Enlightenment, whether it's Leonardo da Vinci's thesis of the Platonic human being. These were all conceptualizations of what it meant to be human, and then they scaled out into every institutional form, every theory of classification, separation, sciences. It rooted through like a genetic virus going through everything and recoding all of our cultural landscapes. So recognize this as a foundational transformation, not just a superficial one. It's not one of product and services and startups. It's a much more rooted transformation. And number 3, I think I would say, is that this is going to happen much faster than you think. I think over the scale of the next 10 years, you're going to see rapid transformations driven by crisis, not driven by great leadership. Crisis is going to be the mother of invention. So surf that wave.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this conversation. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And enjoy the Austrian Alps still for a bit. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
What do you think? Did I overpromise in the beginning of the show when I said that there's a lot to unpack in today's episode? I don't think I did. At least my head was spinning when we left the container, the recording container, the media container, the media facilities at the European Forum Alpbach. But I learned a lot and inspired. It brought a lot of inspiration to me, and I hope also to you. If you like the content, make sure to subscribe to Cities Reimagined or send me an email at johannes@anthropocene.city. Yeah. That was it for today. We will have a lot more shows coming up on the same topic and similar topics, and there will be a lot of linkages in between the shows, so make sure to not miss an episode. But until then, I hope to catch you soon. Bye. Thanks for listening in.